afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Using Skilled Interpreters. Today's program is brought to you by Legal Fuel, the practice resource center of the Florida Bar and Horizon Legal Solutions. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this webinar and will share the link after the event. The recording and any supporting resources will also be posted to our website, legalfuel.com. Any questions you have during today's presentation can be asked through the Q&A feature, which you'll find down at the bottom of your Zoom screen in the control panel. Our presenter will do her best to answer any questions you have. However, due to time constraints, she may not be able to address them all. Today's presentation has been approved by the Florida Bar for 1 hour of General CLE credit, and the course number for today is 4271. Again, the course number is 4271, and it has been approved for 1 hour of General CLE credit. I'd now like to introduce today's presenter, Karina De La Cruz. Karina is the President and Director of Language Pickup by Horizon Legal Solutions. Karina obtained an Associate of Arts in Paralegal Studies from Cooper Career College, and she then went on to obtain her Bachelor's in Business Administration with a major in International Business from Northwood University in West Palm Beach, Florida. Karina attended Nova Southeastern University for her postgraduate Master's in Business Administration degree. As a legal assistant and paralegal for nearly 10 years, Karina was employed by some of the most prominent law firms in South Florida. She saw the need for language services and in 2006 founded Horizon Legal Solutions Incorporated. Now, I'd like you to enjoy the presentation, and I'll hand it over to Karina.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Karina, and I'm the founder and director of Horizon Legal Solutions and Language Pickup, which is the name of our mobile app. I would like to thank Legal Fuel and the Florida Bar for the opportunity to present this topic on using skilled interpreters. Just so you know, I've allocated time for questions and answers at the end of this presentation. A little bit about myself. Jonathan went over it. I attended Northwood University in West Palm Beach, Florida, and where I obtained my bachelor's degree, and then I went on to Nova Southeastern University to obtain my MBA while working as a paralegal. I worked as a paralegal for law firms here in South Florida for approximately 10 years. And with that said, I'm gonna go ahead and get right to it. Has anyone ever had to hire an interpreter? What was your experience? Have you ever forgotten to schedule an interpreter? How many of you have shown up at a deposition or any other type of proceeding where you find out when you get there that the witness doesn't speak English? Well, we have a great tool, which is our mobile app, Language Pickup. I'm going to play this little video here for you. The app is free to download. It's available both on the App Store and Google. You register and then we invoice you. So you go to the app, and from the drop-down menu, you select the language which you desire. You put in your date and your time. So you could see it. I just want to show you what the app does. You put in your location where you want the interpreter to appear. And then after you enter your information, a list of all the interpreters that are available within a 25-mile radius will come up. You can select all the interpreters that are available, or you can select, for example, if you like Carolina and you've worked with her before, you could just select her. The app within 7 minutes will give you a response, whether of who took your job. This is what it sort of like what it looks like when the job has been assigned already. I'm just going to fast forward to this. So the interpreter gets the request. Give me 1 second. They get a text message and a notification within the app. So after you put in your information, this is what you'll see. Right now. So you have the push notification on the app and then a text message, and both the interpreter and you will get that. Then the interpreter will accept or reject the offer, the assignment that you put in. So it's a great tool to have. It's easy. So, I mean, doesn't hurt to download it. I don't know if you guys knew, but there are approximately 6,000 languages in the world. The top 20 languages in the world, in the United States, I'm sorry, based on the American Community Survey, which was conducted in 2017, are English, of course, Spanish, Chinese, Tagalog, Vietnamese, Arabic, French, Korean, Russian, German, Haitian Creole, Hindi, Portuguese, Italian, Polish, Urdu, Yiddish, Japanese, Persian, and Gujarati. So, horse or donkey, interpreter or translator? How many of you think they're the same? I'm pretty sure you use the term translator more often than you use the term interpreter. So now we're going to go over the difference between what an interpreter is and what a translator is. An interpreter's role is to facilitate communication between two people or more. It's all verbal, non-written. Their job is to transfer from the messages from one language to the other while preserving the speaker's intended meaning. Interpreters are used in depositions, mediations, trials, office conferences, medical appointments, etc. How many certifications do you think exist in the state of Florida? There are only 7 languages that have a certification in the state of Florida, and those are Spanish, Haitian Creole. There's only 38 certified Creole interpreters in the entire state. French, we only have 4 in the entire state of Florida. Portuguese, there's just 3. Mandarin, 1. Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian, just 1. So if opposing counsel insists that you hire a state certified interpreter, do not wait to the last minute. Contact your agency, hopefully our agency, so that you can schedule your interpreter, because you have no idea how many times we get a request for the day before for a certified interpreter for a trial for Portuguese, and there's only 3 in the entire state. And a lot of them are usually already booked with criminal cases, because for criminal cases, the state provides the interpreters, but they have to be certified. They can't be like registered or provisionally approved. They have to be certified interpreters to interpret in criminal defense cases. So language skill interpreters, and I'm going to go over what each of this means, what a certified interpreter is and what a language skill interpreter is and what a provisionally approved interpreter is. Language skill interpreters, there's just 1 Romanian and 1 German. Provisionally approved, which again, I'll explain it, the difference later on. There are Spanish, Haitian Creole, Portuguese, and Turkish. The state of Florida also has provisionally approved interpreters, which again, I'll go over later on. There's a term that we use in court interpreting, which is called exotic languages. It's a term that used to refer to languages that are not readily available. For example, Japanese, Arabic, Mandarin, Korean, Hindi, and these languages usually have a 24 to 48 hour cancellation. A lot of these folks, they can survive off of interpreting these types of languages, so they hold regular full-time jobs, and what they do is they take the time off to provide interpretation services, and that's why the 48-hour and 24-hour cancellation exist. So now there are 3 modes of interpretation: simultaneous, consecutive, and sight translation. The simultaneous is where the interpreter is speaking at the same time and the non-English speaker is not involved in the conversation. The simultaneous mode is usually employed during trials, or when you go on vacation and you get a tour guide and they give you the headphones and they're translating simultaneously, meaning at the same time that that they're speaking. The other mode is consecutive mode, which is the most common one. This is the mode that should be used during a deposition so that everyone's not talking over each other. This is when The non-English speaker is involved in the conversation. The interpreter renders statements made in the source language into the target language. Then we have sight translation, which is a combination of interpretation and translation. This is when you're at a deposition or a trial and you hand the interpreter a witness. So this is a combination of both the translation and interpretation. That's why it's called sight translation. I'm going to talk to you about some interesting things that come up in the life of interpreters. I want to point out to you that Spanish from Mexico is the same Spanish from Puerto Rico. Yes, we do have dialects that exist, but in essence, it's the same language. Just like English from the United States, it's the same English in London. We often get requests of, we need a Spanish interpreter from, Honduras, or from, I do have to say, Cubans from Miami. We do tend to, if you have a job in the Miami area, and you tell us it's a Cuban, we obviously have a lot of Cuban interpreters. I find it easier to combine a Cuban interpreter with a Cuban non-English speaker. But in essence, it's the same language, it's Spanish and Spanish. Interpreters can ask for clarification. So if a witness says a word, like for instance, the word corn, in Mexico, they call it elote. In most Spanish-speaking countries, they call it maíz. But what the interpreter would do is they request to get clarification from the witness, and then they can in turn figure out, what it is that the witness intends to say. Okay, now I'm going to move on to phrases that do not translate properly and have no meaning. So there are a lot of phrases. These are two that I just thought of that basically, for instance, in Spanish have no meaning, and I'm pretty sure in other languages too. The phrase "I'm in a pickle," if you interpret it into Spanish, the witness will be like, "Oh." Same thing with "send her on a wild goose chase." So what the interpreter would do in this instance is they find the equivalent in the target language, and then they would use an equivalent phrase or interpret it with the same meaning. I don't know if any of you speak Spanish, but this is a very funny one that I found. There's a beer called Modelo, which is, like I said, the brand of a beer. And in this instance, the lady goes to the bar and the bartender asked her, Modelo, model, which means model, as if she was a model, when he's really offering her just the beer, Modelo. So I don't know if anybody can read Spanish, but she took it as a compliment and said, no, I'm not a model, I'm a housewife. So this is just some of the things that really make no sense and have no meaning. And this is a joke to you, but when I tell it to you in English, it's like, you don't really get it. Okay. So why is it important to have an interpreter present? It is important to have an interpreter present anytime your client is making an important decision. If there's a prenuptial agreement, I've seen many cases where one of the person signing the prenup, after there was a lot of litigation because they said that they didn't have an interpreter present and that they didn't fully understand the prenuptial agreement. So there was a lot of litigation in that case. At mediations, it's good to have an interpreter. I understand, like a lot of Spanish-speaking attorneys like to interpret themselves for their clients, but I always tell them avoid unnecessary litigation and have an interpreter present. Whenever your client is signing something, include a translator's clause that says that the interpreter read the document from English to Spanish or whatever language it was, and then have both the interpreter and the person signing sign it. At trials, it's good to have, obviously, an interpreter. At closings, anytime your client is making an important decision. I've seen many times where they were at a mediation, the interpreter excuse me, the attorney was interpreting for their client. Then the client goes home, and when it's time to sign the closing statement, they're like, this is not what I agreed to. This is not what the attorney told me. So then, then you have a problem, because then your client doesn't want to sign the closing statement. So it's always good to have an interpreter present and cover all your bases. So who certifies interpreters in the state of Florida? The Supreme Court of the state of Florida does. There's a program, and they certify the interpreters, and I'm going to go over how they get their certification on the next slide. So Florida rules of certification of court interpreters, which is rule 14.100. A certified interpreter is the highest designation that an interpreter can obtain. This means that the interpreter has met all the requirements. There's a 3-day workshop that they have to attend. There's a written exam that they take, and then there's an oral exam. There's also 20 hours of courtroom observation that is required for them to get their certification. There's interpreters also have continuing education, which if they don't continue taking classes, their certification can be suspended or revoked. There's then the term called language skill interpreter, which is a term when an interpreter has met all the requirements to become a certified interpreter, they're a language skill interpreter. The only difference is that the interpreter, the state does not offer a test, an oral exam for them. So as I mentioned in the other slides, there were some language skill interpreters like Romanian, we have one. So they do all of their, the courtroom observation, they do their written exam and then the 3-day workshop, but then there's no oral exam for them. So that's when they're language skilled. A provisionally approved interpreter, it's one that has met the majority of the requirements, but obtain a low score on the oral examination. And then they have 2 years to retake the test. If not, they're not on the roster anymore. They won't be provisionally approved. Then there's the registered court interpreter, which is the initial step. It's just basically telling the court, I started the process of becoming certified, and so they give you this the registered court interpreter title when you begin the process. There is rule 2.565D of the Judicial Administration, Florida Rules of Judicial Administration, which says when you cannot find a certified interpreter or a language skill interpreter or a provisionally approved interpreter, you can use the services of a professional interpreter. I can tell you there's many times, actually, we just had a case right now where we had to fly, as you recall, there was only one Mandarin interpreter in the entire state of Florida. And we had to fly, this is the 3rd time already we do this. We had to fly from Atlanta, a Mandarin interpreter to interpret because opposing counsel will not let anybody else do it. And we only have one. So, we reached out to the one. We can also offer a language skill interpreter, but opposing counsel insisted on the interpreter being certified. So it definitely cost one of the parties a lot of money to fly the guy down here from Atlanta and pay. It was like an 8 days of depositions out of China. And the bill was definitely substantial. But if you come and you refer to this rule will get you out of, paying all that money. The next slide is how to help your proceedings go smooth when an interpreter is involved. Well, the first step is give the agency as much information as possible, especially when dealing with high-profile cases. You don't want a medical interpreter on if it's an airplane's part case that you have. If it's a maritime law case or medical malpractice, you should try to hire an interpreter that has that background so that you can get the best interpreter possible for that case. We asked a few of our interpreters to give us some feedback on, how attorneys can help them. to make their job easier. And some of the things that they said is break down compound questions, speak slowly and clearly so that no details are missed. A big issue that came up was objections. We asked them if they interpreted objections. Well, interpreters are supposed to interpret objections. They should have, the non-English speakers should have the same benefit as someone who speaks English. But many times the attorneys advise the interpreters not to interpret the objections, and a lot of times it also confuses the witness. So they said, advise the interpreter from the beginning if you do not want the objections interpreted. We also asked them questions regarding remote proceedings. For remote proceedings, they said, advise the witness to use verbal responses, advise them to be, prior to the deposition or whatever proceeding it is, advise them to be in a quiet place where there's not a lot of noise, avoid construction zones. We've had some depositions where the employee or a supervisor was at the job site, and it was very difficult for the interpreter to hear with all the noise in the background. They also said avoid conducting depositions from your car or while driving, and make sure you have a strong internet connection. One of the other things that came up is that, remember, and not just for remote proceedings, but remember that when there are arguments between lawyers, the interpreter cannot jump and tell you to be quiet or to stop so that they can interpret. It's very difficult for the interpreter to control that. They basically have no say in it. So the interpreter cannot interpret to the witness, as those arguments often occur too quickly. So not just for remote proceedings, but also for in-person proceedings, make sure you keep this in mind. Keep in mind that the interpreter cannot interrupt you. Now we are going to talk about translators. So translators, translation is converting written text from one language to another. Commonly needed for legal documents such as birth certificates, marriage certificates, wills. The translation should be a mirror image of the original. So let's say if you have a document and it has the title, and then it has let's say if it's a birth certificate, the title be birth certificate, and then the name, and then the date, the translation should follow the same format as the original one. Like, you don't have, if a translation has the birthday first, and then the name after, it doesn't follow the original one, it's not a good translation. It has to be a mirror image of the original. Now we're going to talk on the next slide is, how do you certify a translation? So one of the things that comes up a lot is we get requests for a certified interpreter to do a certified translation. And an interpreter that is certified through the state of Florida is not a certified translator. The American Translators Association is one of the largest organizations which certifies translators. So, just because the interpreter was certified by the state of Florida for it, and the written exam is actually in English. It's really an English a comprehension test. The oral is in English in their language, whichever language they're testing for. But just because they can speak it, you have to remember, doesn't mean that they can write it or that they know the proper grammar to do a translation. A certificate of accuracy is what actually certifies a translation. And a certificate of accuracy, basically, it's the translator stating that the translation is true, correct, complete, and it's to the best of their ability and knowledge. Some agencies, and we see this a lot with when dealing with foreign countries, they like the certificate of accuracy to be notarized. I guess to them, it's like the notary, it's legalizing or authenticating the document, but that's not true. When a notary notarizes a certificate of accuracy, it's basically stating that the translator took an oath and said that the translation was done to the best of their ability and belief. We do it if you want it with the notary seal, if the agency is requiring it, whatever makes you compliant, we will do. But again, keep in mind that a certified interpreter is not a certified translator. Okay, now we're going to talk about professional conduct. Interpreters should be impartial and unbiased. They should avoid getting involved in cases where there's a conflict of interest. So this is actually an interesting one because I know a lot of people have their family members or a friend interpret for them when they go to like a trial or a mediation but there's really a conflict of interest because they're not going to be neutral when interpreting for that other person. They're going to see whatever's being said through the eyes of the person that they're interpreting for. So definitely avoid conflict of interest. Interpreters can have disciplinary action taken against them for not adhering to the rules. Most importantly, interpreters cannot give legal advice. This is something that comes up a lot, and we always tell our interpreters, you know, it's easy to be at a mediation sitting with a client and for the client, your client, to ask the interpreter, what do you think? Well, what's your opinion? It's really not the interpreter's role to give their opinion or their advice. They should immediately turn to the lawyer for advice. Interpreters they have a code of ethics. They have to render complete and accurate interpretation without altering, omitting, or adding anything to what was being said and without explanation. So this is actually comes up in mediations, depositions. I've seen it where, you know, the attorney's like telling the interpreter, well, can you please explain that to them? You know, it's not the interpreter's job to explain anything to the client. It's you're the counsel. It's your job to do it. You don't want to put that job on their hands. They're not the ones with the law degree. Interpreters should tell their credentials. They should be unbiased and impartial, and they should also protect the confidentiality of all privileged and confidential information. I would get a request for an interpreter, and let's say the attorney that, you know, his attorney wants to do a pre-deposition conference with him, and then we also get hired for the deposition conference. We always make our clients happy. I've had attorneys say, no, we want two different interpreters. I don't want the interpreter doing the pre-depo, doing the depo. But interpreters are not there. They're supposed to be impartial. They're not there to, you know, be on anyone's side. So it's perfectly okay for an interpreter doing the pre-depo to do the deposition as well, because they're neutral. They're not supposed to be on anyone's side. And all the information that you discussed during your pre-depo conference or pre-mediation conference or your trial preparation, it's all privileged and confidential. They're not supposed to discuss it with anyone. Same thing when you are at a mediation and the interpreter's there. The interpreter cannot go home and tell their family, you know, how much the case settled for or what the terms of the agreements were. All that should remain confidential. So in other words, if you are speaking to your client and an interpreter is present, you should know that everything, the information safe, it can't go anywhere. Now, why is it important to hire an interpreter directly through an agency? Well, it's important because we know the rules. Your request won't get lost in translations. There's a lot of times that, well, this happens very often where the attorney's office hires the interpreter through the court reporter's office. And if it's, let's say, we could be dealing with an audio file with which we've dealt before many times. And the audio file contains parts in English, you know, where there was a conversation in English, and then in the middle, there's a conversation in Spanish, or, you know, and then you send it to the court reporter's office. It gets lost in translation. The court reporter sends it to us and they say, you know, just get this translated. But when you really only wanted was the Spanish part or the Creole part to be translated from the audio. Same thing with documents. You know, they're court reporters. They don't know, how to deal with certificate of accuracy or what, institutions need the seal, the notary seal, because they like it notarized. It's important so that your request doesn't get lost in translation. It also saves your clients money because the court reporters, they have to make money. They have to make a profit. So subbing it, they usually sub the work to us. Another thing is that with languages, a Chinese, you request a Chinese interpreter. Well, Chinese, there's Cantonese and there's Mandarin. Which of the two it is? You save so much time if you have a request for an interpreter and you go directly through the agency. It saves a lot of time for sure. And you'll save your clients tons and tons of money. All right, I think I went through that pretty fast, but I am gonna go back and see if there's anything else that I missed. And let me go through the chat. Anybody has any questions? Oh, someone has a question. Is only an app? Oh, well, so we have a website and an app, just so you know. But I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna talk a little bit about the dialects and the interpreters. So I want to give you guys examples of when hiring an interpreter. I said Spanish is Spanish and it's just one language, just like French is French and Russian is Russian. So if you do have a client that's from, you have to take into consideration that if you have a client that's from Mexico, from Guatemala, there are 23 dialects in Guatemala. So, and then also they might say that they speak some English. I'm sorry, they speak some Spanish, but you get to the deposition, you request a Spanish interpreter, and they're really not comfortable. So I really encourage you guys to be familiar with the language that your client speaks, especially if they're from like Mexico or Guatemala. If you see that if maybe one of your staff, someone in your office can tell, there's a lot of cultural things too, that people from Guatemala and Central America are very shy. They're not very open. So they'll pretend like, yeah, I speak Spanish, but a lot of them just learn Spanish coming here because they come from a village in Guatemala where, let's say, Canjobal was the language that was spoken. And then again, remember with whether Spanish, French, Italian, interpreters can get clarification. They can ask for permission when there's a deposition. They're supposed to, ask for permissions, get clarification for whatever it is that they don't understand. And again, the best advice that I can give when hiring interpreters is try to give them as much information as possible. We had a case in Germany with interpreters here and interpreters in Germany, and they needed to know, what the case was about. And it was a high profile case and involving a lot of technical, terms. So we were able to get a hold of the original complaint and send it to the interpreters. That doesn't mean that the interpreter is cheating or, you're better preparing them for, when the deposition takes place. That way they're not a dictionary. If they have something that they can look at or have an idea of what the case is about, they can familiarize themselves with, whatever, or, freshen up with whatever terminology they need to. We were also conducting a lot of medical interviews, and there's actually a medically certified interpreter. So there are interpreters that are not just certified by the state of Florida, but they're also certified for medical terminology. So if you have a medical malpractice case, get somebody with that background. Give whoever you're hiring as much information as possible so that the interpreter can do a better job. If there's if your client has some kind of disability, like a hearing, or, there's a lot of things that come up. Like you'd as an interpreter, you would show up at a deposition and you think that the interpreter is the one, not doing their job, but your client has some kind of disability, and understanding, and not just so much disability, but I would say the culture, and they're shy and they can't talk or they can't hear. But just because, so if they have a disability, let's say, and they can't listen, they can't hear from, they have a hearing problem, just because of their culture, they're probably not going to tell you anything. So it's very obviously, as attorneys, it's important for you to know your clients and what their needs are, so that you can properly assist them in their case. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about is document translation. Let me go back to the translations. Give me 1 second. So when you have a translation, a lot of times the translator that's assigned to the job, to the translation, doesn't have the country. Like, for instance, different countries have different forms that they need to do, that they need to translate. For Spain, this is a big one, because the Spanish used in Spain is actually, they try to make everything prettier and harder, I would say. And so the Spanish that they use, it's there, I would say it's definitely different from, from the Spanish used in other countries. So look at the documents that you have, so that, again, just as you would assign an interpreter, that's best suited for your client, you can also have a translator that's best suited for the translation. We had a case also recently. We had a request for a Hebrew interpreter, and the attorney had never hired an interpreter. So thankfully, he was happy and everything went fine, because he hired us directly, and we were able to walk him through the process. One of the issues that we have been encountering with Zoom is when you're at a trial or a hearing in Zoom, all the parties are there. And so they mute the interpreter. Everybody's talking over each other, and then the interpreter is trying to keep up and try to interpret to your client. So the judge has just been muting the interpreter. So the solution that we found for this problem is, prior to the trial or the hearing, we get a landline or a different number to call your client from, because you can't be talking over each other. The judges have basically just been muting the interpreters now with Zoom meetings. So make sure that if that's the case, if you have to hire an interpreter for your trial, your hearing, and if you think about it, it makes sense, because you don't want everyone talking, over each other. So I'm just going to keep reviewing this and see if there's anything else I missed. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat section. Again, I'll emphasize on the fact that the interpreters are not supposed to give legal advice. You should feel confident, when talking to your clients in front of an interpreter. They can get their certification suspended or revoked if they break the rules, if they don't adhere to the rules. And I think that's pretty much all I have. If anyone has any questions, I know I went kind of fast, and it's definitely different not being in person, because if this was in person, I definitely would make it more interactive. So let me go to the chat box and see if there's any questions. Guess no one has any questions? Oh. Okay, so somebody asked again about the app. So we have a website and an app that you can use, but the app does help you find the interpreter within 20 to 25 miles of where you are. And as I stated, it's free to download. It doesn't cost a thing, and it's a great thing to have. Let's say you're at home and it's 9 o'clock and you forgot to book the interpreter. If you register for our app, you can book the interpreter from the comfort of your home and not have to worry about, the agency opening at 8:30 in the morning for you to book your interpreter. So, and you'll get an answer within 7 minutes, as I stated. I think that is pretty much all I have. Jonathan?
No, I don't see any more questions. So yeah,
I'll just go over the PowerPoint again just one more time to make sure I didn't miss anything. Right. So I guess, well, here that is. That's the app. Languages. So, I mean, Spanish is obviously one of the most common ones, languages used here. I would say Haitian Creole is number 2 and Portuguese is number 3. Then we get a lot of Mandarin requests here in Florida, from what I've seen. We do cover the entire state of Florida. A lot of times, something that I mentioned with interpreters, a lot of time, the rare languages interpreters, they're not readily available. So don't be surprised if an agency charges you travel time for an interpreter to, you know, go to a live in-person deposition or mediation. You're not going to find a Yiddish interpreter, you know, around West Palm Beach. So, because I've looked, and we'd have to fly people here from time to time. Let's see what else. Again, interpreter and translator, don't confuse the two. Interpreter is verbal, translator is written. They do documents, the translators do documents, the interpreter do verbal. I know everybody, when they call, they request a translator, but really I know they're requesting an interpreter. And again, everything an interpreter does is verbal, and they're supposed to keep the speaker's intended meaning. So they're not supposed to change things around. I had, actually, because nothing's perfect, we had a complaint the other day, and of course we stopped using this person. And you know what, it's sad, but you know, it's a hard, I would say an interpreter's job is not easy. We had a lady who the answer was yes, of course. And when she went to interpret the question, she just said yes. So she didn't interpret that of course part of it. So, and you know, the client was not happy with it. So, you know, but it's definitely things to keep in mind. Again, when you need to get a certified interpreter, as soon as you know, if you have a trial for court, all the interpreters have to be either certified, language skill, or provisionally approved. So, I mean, after the agency has exhausted all of this, like if the agency has already reached out to everyone on their roster that's certified, language skill, or provisionally approved or co-registered, and no one's available, then they can hire a professional interpreter. But when you're in court, you know, certified interpreters is what they prefer. So if you have a hearing or a trial and you know it's coming up, don't wait and book your interpreter. Cancellation policies vary from cities to cities here in Florida. In South Florida, we have a 3-hour cancellation for Spanish, 3-hour window where you can book your interpreter for, let's say, you know, today. And then if your job's for tomorrow at 2 o'clock and you cancel it at 9, you're not going to get charged for it. So it's always better to have an interpreter on standby. On the rest of the state, the cancellation policy is 24 hours. So for everything else, I think here in South Florida, because we have such a high demand for interpreters, we do have a better deal, I guess. Then again, exotic languages, those are quite expensive. And there's usually 24 to 48 hour cancellation. And those, there's really no exception for those. Let's see, I think I see an open question. What do you do when someone requests an interpreter, but throughout the meeting keeps on speaking fluent English? Okay, so here's a good question. What do you do when someone requests an interpreter, but throughout the meeting keeps on speaking English? I would, whoever hired you, the attorney that hired you, I would ask them if they would prefer for, you know, you to, you know, speak to them in their native language if you're the interpreter, or if they don't need the interpreter. I mean, a lot of times the interpreters are hired as backup too. They speak, the witnesses are fluent, and the attorneys just hire the interpreter in case there's something that the witness doesn't understand. But it should all be conducted in one language just to keep the flow going and not to get anybody confused. So let me keep going. Again, simultaneous, I heard of attorneys that like to conduct a position simultaneously. That it's very, very confusing for the interpreters. You're definitely gonna get some of the words left out because if everyone's talking at the same time, it's hard for the interpreter to catch everything. So I've actually, I know we have interpreters that do it, that do the simultaneous mode when they're doing a deposition, but it's harder because everyone's talking at the same time, and you're gonna lose some of the of the words that you said, whatever you said, some of it is gonna get lost because it's almost impossible unless the only time this method should be employed is when the non-English speaker is not involved in the proceedings. And then let's see, like I said, interpreters with the clarification, there's a lot of words that are different. Like for instance, the word flip-flop in a countries in Spanish is sandalia, and then the other one's chancla. So there goes clarification. And that's common. That's something that happens on an everyday interpreter's life. I think that is pretty much all I have. Again, I'm reiterating, just it's so important whenever your client's signing something or making a life-changing decision for the an interpreter to be present. And remember, like if you have, we usually have like, oh no, my son is going to interpret for me. Think the son is not, a lot of the things that the attorneys are saying, if it's a family member that is interpreting for you, they're thinking your best interest, or God only knows what they're thinking. So it's better to have someone neutral there, have an interpreter there, because it's just not going to be the same. And I think that is pretty much all I have, unless anyone else has any questions. I'll repeat again for attorneys that are present during this webinar: break down the questions, speak slowly and clearly in short phrases so that nothing's missed. Remember, interpreters are humans, they're not, machines. So they have to capture what you say and then interpret it. So if you have a long sentence, some of the stuff it's gonna get left out if you're not breaking it down. So let's see what else I have. We've, like I said, a lot of the complaints from the interpreters have been that attorneys are conducting depositions while driving, which is it's not safe. So avoid that. And oh, another thing that came up was echoes. Make sure that you're in a room when there's not a lot of echo, because that definitely it's not it interrupts the interpreter's job. And definitely have high sound quality. Zoom is usually a very good platform for depositions and those types of proceedings. And then I think that's pretty much all I have. Yep, that's all I have.
So thank you, Karina. We really appreciate your time today for the presentation. And again,
Thank
for
you.
everybody that's attending, the course number for today was 4271, and we will be posting the recording to our website at legalfuel.com. So thank you again to Karina, and thank you for everybody in attendance. Have a good
Thank you. Have a
rest of
good
your
one.
afternoon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.